I'm going to introduce the moderator of our next session. It's a panel on artificial intelligence and machine learning. We've got a lot of collective intelligence assembled up on stage, and you're going to be interested in this. I'm going to introduce Wendy, who's going to moderate the panel. Wendy Reid is a senior QA at Rakuten Kobo and has spent the last few years on the other side of I can't read today, sorry. Has spent the last few years on the other side of EPUB mysteries and reading system technology. She is currently one of the co-chairs of the publishing working group of the W3C and leads the audiobook task force. In her abundant spare time, she likes to learn about new technologies and read as many ebooks as she can. Take it away, Wendy.
Thanks, Laura. Can everyone hear me? Oh, now I can hear myself. Welcome to our panel. Today we are going to be talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how that applies to book production. So I have with me up here some very, very intelligent people, and maybe you guys want to introduce yourselves one by one, because you can probably do a better job than I can.
Hi, I'm Monica Landers. I'm founder and CEO of StoryFit. We apply AI in both the book world and the movie studio world. I think the other bits of my experience that's relevant is that I ran an R&D group for about 7 years within a content technology company. And so a lot of this, like how do you bring in new technology, is something I've been into a company, is something I've been focusing on for a long time. And I think is often harder than it looks. So I'm happy to be here today to get to talk about how to bring complex technology into companies.
Jens?
Hello, my name is Jens Tröger. I'm the founder of Bookalope, which is a set of tools that helps you analyzing books, build ebooks, build print books. There's lots of AI in that process as well. I guess we're talking about that later. Louder. Oh, louder? Can you hear me? Yes. That's pretty much it.
Joshua.
I'm Joshua Tallent. I'm the Director of Sales and Education at Firebrand Technologies, and I'm an ebook guy, so there you go.
So I wanted to start the panel today. I know we're kind of covering something that's a little bit maybe scary sounding for people. You probably have heard a lot about machine learning and artificial intelligence in the news. It's kind of one of those technologies that it's like blockchain. Like every startup is throwing those words around, maybe correctly, maybe not so correctly. And we thought, why don't we introduce it? Because it's really not as hard as you think. It's really not that scary, but there's a lot of words that we're going to use. We're actually going to have a glossary that'll be up the whole time. So if we say something you don't understand, hopefully the definition will be there. We're also going to do questions at the end. So if we say anything that maybe wasn't in the glossary or you really want to know about, please feel free to ask. We're here to answer all of your questions. So I'm going to give a quick intro. So we're talking about two things here, machine learning and artificial intelligence. Machine learning is the scientific study of algorithms and statistical models that computer systems use to effectively perform a specific task without using explicit instructions, instead relying on patterns and inference. And artificial intelligence is the theory and development of computer systems that are able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. Remember that intelligence is not equal to consciousness, such as visual perception, speech recognition, decision-making, and translation between languages. It's probably where you've seen most applications of AI lately. And a brief history, because the field has actually been around for a lot longer than most people really think, especially considering the growth of it in the last couple of years. So most people probably know Alan Turing, very famous for creating the Turing test. But between him and another scientist named Church, in the 30s and 50s, they theorized that a machine can simulate any process of formal reasoning. It's known as the Church-Turing thesis. In 1956, AI was founded at the Dartmouth College with the claim that human intelligence can be so precisely described that a machine can simulate it. That was their thesis. In 1959, machine learning was defined as progressively improving performance of a specific task without the need to reprogram the task, so creating something that can learn from itself. But very interestingly, there was that period, there's a lot of talk and a lot of research into AI and machine learning. But in the 1970s and 1990s, we refer to this period as an AI winter. Computers just weren't powerful enough. There wasn't enough, a lot of theories, but not enough power to kind of reach those goals. So what we see from the 1990s till today is that thanks to the dramatic increase in data and computing power that we see, training of things like what we call narrow AIs, so stuff you've probably seen on television, IBM Watson, Google's AlphaGo, other applications like that that can do very, very specific things are possible thanks to computing power. So, and that's why we're here today. So I'm going to just leave this up on the screen. These are some terms that we're going to probably use throughout the presentation, but feel free to read at your leisure. So I wanted to open up with, first is describe how you are using artificial intelligence and machine learning today in your business. How do you apply it? And just so the audience understands how you guys are using it. You want to go first?
So if you take AI as a big picture and ML smaller, we focus on a very specific part of machine learning called NLP, natural language processing. So we are really focused on the text within a book or a movie itself, which is a very narrow focus. And part of where machine learning is today, too, is that there are these broad applications, but to get really good and get precise information, it requires different focus. So that's the focus that StoryFit uses, is just on understanding the words across the narrative. Jens?
My problem is a little bit different in a sense that the AIs that I'm building are considered classification AIs, which means that their job is to assign labels to unknown things. For example, you take a Word document, you don't know if this particular paragraph is a chapter, it's a section, it's actually a paragraph, it's part of a poem. These are all labels for paragraphs, and so the AIs that I'm working with, their job is to look at the formatting of these documents and kind of derive the labels, the semantic meaning of the paragraphs from the way the paragraphs are formatted. And that's a classical classification problem.
Mm-hmm. Joshua?
Just like what Monica was saying about StoryFit, we're working mostly with natural language processing, just in the sense of trying to understand how people think about books, what people say about books, generating keywords based on that concept.
Mm-hmm. We're still very much kind of in the exploratory phase of seeing where both of these technologies can help us. Because we do so much, we do everything from self-publishing to just our own quality stuff. We probably are looking very much at classification to see, like, can we help self-published authors produce better EPUBs, or can we use it to improve recommendations, or things like that. We have a service called Shelfie that we're still looking at that just looks at book spines. So there's lots of things out there, but we're still exploring, so it's fun to learn. Mm-hmm. So where do you guys see this field kind of helping the publishing industry the most, especially today? Like, where do you see the biggest impact? I feel like Jens maybe has the best answer.
I think there are different fields in publishing, right? I mean, there's the content creation, there's the content conversion, there's content management, there's content analysis. Like these are all kind of things we do as we're creating books, as we're working with books. And each of these fields, I think, could benefit from using different kinds of AIs. And for example, with content analysis, that's kind of what I'm looking at is, can we classify content automatically so that editors and publishers don't have to sit and pore over the documents and kind of label all the paragraphs because the software needs that. That's the kind of tedious task that AI can solve for us. Mm-hmm. Content generation, I'm sure you've seen, what's that website with the created my face thing?
Oh, the thispersondoesnotexist.com.
Right.
Go there now, thispersondoesnotexist.com. Very interesting AI tool. The pictures that you see do not exist. That person does not exist. It's all created by AI. And there was another one that I saw today, actually. NVIDIA just released, theirs is still in development stages, but they released an AI system that can take basically an MS Paint looking drawing and turn it into what looks like a real photorealistic landscape.
Wow.
Yeah,
So.
and that's the content creation part, right? And there's a lot of, if you pay attention to the news, you keep reading, this guy wrote that AI which simulates the writings of Mark Twain, so it generates a blob of text, which when you read it, reads very similar to how Mark Twain would have written. It's just not his writing, but it's a close enough simulation, and I think it's very important to understand that's what AI does, right? It's a tool, it does get stuff done, it helps us achieve something. We need to make sure we use it in the right way.
Yeah. I think on the where it applies to publishers, how publishers can benefit from it, like you're saying, content creation is part of that potentially, content analysis and being able to use it. I think on the marketing side, there's a very big picture here for publishers, because you're dealing with how do I market products into a very crowded space, an even more crowded space every year with a longer tail of books over time. You need to be able to stand out, and that's hard to do if you don't have the marketing capabilities to actually fight against all of the other input coming into people. You have to have some ability to engage that. AI is a tool, like any other tool, to give you a leg up, or to keep you up to pace in some cases. It depends on how that works.
I think any application where you have a lot of content, a lot of measurements, and a lot of comparisons, and so is where you can apply AI. So real-time pricing is an example. And another is if you have an idea but you don't know how it stacks. For example, when we're looking thematically across books, what really matters is this book unique? Like, does it have a theme that's really unique in this genre, for example? And so to say that, you really want to compare across thousands of books, right? Not just the books that you've read or you can think of. And so those are good applications for AI. It's something that you want to do it quickly, you need an idea, and it matters that you look across a large corpus.
I think it's a great way to take a lot of data and distill it in ways that are most effective, instead of someone just pouring through spreadsheets or all the ways we gather.
There's no way a single person could do that anyway, right? I mean, your ability to process that information is limited because you have a limited amount of processing space in your head. A computer that's doing this process can handle millions of data sets, millions of pieces of data, comparing them all one to another, seeing similarities, assuming it's built correctly, and that's a part of the problem as well, we'll talk about, but you have the ability to benefit from a very specific type of algorithm that can do a very specific kind of thing that you as a person just can't do.
I think that actually probably leads pretty well into one of my other questions was a part of machine learning and AI that I find personally very fascinating is that it's not really immune to bias and bad training, right? What do you have to consider when you're designing something to avoid that bias or that bad behavior, perhaps? And as I think we've seen, and there's some examples from the internet of, things going kind of hilariously wrong. I think my favorite one is, I don't know if anyone remembers the story of the Microsoft Twitter bot.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah, it's my favorite bad AI story where people thought, oh, it'll emulate humans, but
well, maybe it did.
It kind of did, but not the good ones.
Yeah,
so.
It became horribly racist and
very quickly
and horrible in every way possible. Its tweets were very ugly.
Very ugly, but it's interesting is because that could have been prevented if they had thought about that. But how do you think about that when you design something?
Well, we have a couple ways of doing that. So on your glossary, it mentions neural net and feature engineering. And neural net, I'm going to really simplify this, but neural net is a way of throwing everything in the box and letting the machine kind of sort through it and spit back out an answer. But it means you don't know the whys. You don't have the reason codes underneath. So it gives you this comparison, but it leaves the machine totally on its own. And that's what happened in this example. Another way is to do feature engineering. And so there's a human element here for good or bad. So if you use the feature engineering, it means you're deciding what you measure. So we use, for example, the books. What are you going to measure out of it? Well, we're going to count the number of characters, how much this character talks to another character, whether they're happy or sad, what the themes, so hundreds of thousands of elements, right? And so then you put that into the machine learning box. So now when you get results, you know where it's coming from. And we often use both of those to compare because you want to look for similar results, but then also you want to check into the reason codes and see what's popping up. And the only way to get reason codes that make sense to a human are to use feature engineering. But as you can hear, this means that we've chosen what we measure out of it. Now, there's lots of machine learning techniques to figure out how to measure, so there's lots of ways to do this. But I think it is important to ask the questions of what are the human elements along the way in building whatever machine learning program you're using, because that gives you insight as to what the potentials are for misfires. And also, good test for the loop around is a human should review, and we have internal, I have gobs of interns every semester who are happy to be in this crossover space, right, between technology and literature, to review it too, and just to check and see what's coming out, because that's really important to watch for and catch something before the crazy meme bot goes off the rails.
You guys have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think you have to be careful as well. The input that you're giving, it's the process that you create, but it's also the input. This is a big problem in the scientific world. Recent conversations about how the data sets that they're using to do this AI and machine learning processing, try to figure out, okay, here's a conclusion we can come to based on all of these studies. Well, if the studies are flawed, then you've got a problem with the potential output that comes out of it. It's garbage in, garbage out, just like any other system. You have to be very careful about what you put into it in order to understand that what comes out of it can be more accepted and understood.
Yeah, that's, I think, a really interesting point to make is that a lot of the research you do is you realize that algorithms are not immune to even human bias. If the data you put in is because you personally selected it, and everyone has biases of their own, your model will just spit out your biases pretty much right back at you, which is very interesting.
I mean, I've built the algorithm, I've selected the data, so these choices will reflect in how the thing functions and what it produces. And I find it quite interesting how AI has become kind of a recent buzzword. Back in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, at school they wouldn't teach artificial intelligence like they do today. Back then it was called data mining. Right? Because there was only this growing amount of data that people realized the internet started to spread, and we get access to more and more data, but what are we doing with this data? And so that new field kind of grew out of mathematics and statistics called data mining. And so people started to look for correlations and similarities in data and started to kind of make sense of all these blobs of data, and out of that eventually grew what is called today artificial intelligence, because it seems it seems intelligent what that blob of code tells me, but we shouldn't forget that it's a blob of code, right? It tells me what I told it to tell me in a way. So if I mess that up, then the result is funny. Or sad, kind of.
So if the robot overlords kill us in the end, it's our own fault because we wrote the code the wrong way?
That's right.
Yeah.
It is.
It's because that's actually what we wanted.
It's actually what we wanted,
So what are your thoughts on technology like this in creative industries? I was thinking about this question because I think there's a lot of, when you think about, I think Dartmouth College has a really famous prize where if someone can get an AI to write a short story that could be published in the New Yorker, they'll give you $10,000 or something. And it obviously has not happened yet. I don't know if anyone's ever read a short story written currently by AI, but it's really funny. It'll start pretty good and then get really strange. But I think that feeds into a lot of anxieties of what if, the robots take over? But what are your thoughts or your feelings?
Well, we're already seeing some things being written by AI, by algorithms. I mean, a lot of sports articles, even news articles, business articles are being written by computers that have the data. But if you read them, you can tell that it's a bunch of stats, right? It's baseball stats or something. It's not really real detailed. I don't see this becoming a huge problem for, all authors are going to go out of business. You can never write another book. Creativity still comes from human effort. I think that there may be a case where somebody at Dartmouth actually wins that, sure. But that doesn't mean that that's going to be the best story, or that it's going to hit really the emotional points that a human would hit. There's going to be something different still about human interaction on that.
Another, Sunspring is the name of an AI-produced movie and it's on YouTube, and I giggle every time I see it because the actors acted out this script with like, real effort. And the script, have you seen it? Or I see you nodding your head. It's funny. It's like 15 minutes. But that's just kind of example of where it is today. And probably that's the question I fearfully get the most is, are you trying to write content when we work with creatives? And no, we're certainly not. We're trying to understand it in different ways to then let creatives actually look at their own work kind of out of the box. And so we look at what do you need to measure to actually recognize that it's a hero's journey? What do you need to measure to recognize whether you have a unique character or whether you've fallen into some stereotypical traps, which you might want. You need stereotypical characters to carry the story sometime. But so the way we approach it is to say, hey, is this what you're trying to do? So that you're able to create the book or the movie that you want to create. And so it's like having someone else in the room to ask the questions or to notice things that you wouldn't have seen because you can't read 100,000 books and compare that, instantly. But I think that it's a real challenge, and everyone ought to, I don't know, like, give yourself some credit. Like, there's a reason it's hard to adopt new technology, especially as it changes so fast, and it requires you to change the way you think and work. And this is a real hurdle to get over. And I learned through a lot of mistakes at a company of getting this great app or something that once my team got it working, we'd hand it off to the rest of the company. And boy, when that handoff wasn't well done, it failed. And sometimes lesser technology had a better handoff and was used and integrated into the company. And so this handoff is tricky, and I just think it's important to recognize it just so because there is a level, I think, of frustration of starting to use something that presents information differently. But I also think it's valuable. You feel that way every time you get a new phone, right? It's like a couple of days of going, where do I find how I used to work? But if my opinion, if you don't force yourself to jump those hurdles pretty regularly, then the pain level just goes up even further. Mm-hmm. And so we spend time with some of these big technology companies that feel like competitors, right? And they are just testing this stuff like crazy. And so that's part of what I always feel like and we were talking about this before, like if we can be a friend to the industry and to individuals to understand how in the world do you use this new tool internally, that's always something that brings me a lot of pleasure, because I think that is such a hard handoff, but boy, then when it works and can save time and save efficiency, that's the big win.
I think that's one of the most important things to emphasize is AI is a tool to make my life easier.
Right.
Personally, for me, that was the whole motivation of why I started writing one, because I like designing book, I like well-designed books, and I just got tired of having to deal with messed up manuscripts, right? And so I shouldn't be dealing with it, but I had to. And so the solution would be a decent tool that helps me deal with that. So take the pain out of that so that I can actually do what I really want to do, which is play around with typefaces and book design and do the fun things and let the machine do the boring stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think AI should be doing.
Yeah,
it's a tool.
It's a tool to make your life a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If anything, I think maybe a good way to describe it is it used properly and used with intention, you can actually use it to facilitate the creative process.
Yes, absolutely.
That's something we've been looking at in some of our exploration is how do we, is it possible to make, a lot of our focus is on making people's reading lives better. So can we use, an AI to bring up summaries of things to help someone understand the content of a book, or can we use it to help someone understand the plot of their novel better, so that when they want to publish, they know, oh, there's kind of an issue in my plot. I need to clean that up. But this is all early day exploration. But it's I think the idea is to facilitate creativity, not take it over, I guess. So what are you guys most excited about in the intersection between, this technology and the content world? Where do you see the future going? Or tomorrow?
It's rosy and beautiful.
Rosy and beautiful.
I like the practical application of technologies like this. Like being able to say, like Jens was saying a moment ago, being able to say, I don't have to do that silly thing that I used to spend 2 hours doing. I can hit a button, it happens, I'm done with that. I can focus on what's really important to me. That's the job of any tool, is to make your life easier, make your life better. You know, everything from a car, I can get somewhere faster and quicker, you know, faster and more efficiently than walking or taking a horse. You know, the whole idea with any tool is to help you. And so that's where I see this benefiting publishers, both, you know, on the production side and on the marketing side and on other sides within the publishing house. You know, for those of us in the room who do ebook production, for the, you know, people who are trying to figure out how do I repackage my EPUB 2s as an EPUB 3, you know, or how do I fix all those old EPUBs that Teresa was talking about, you know, that shouldn't be something we have to deal with. That should be the kind of thing you pop it into the AI figures it out, and oh, this is what it's supposed to be, and then you verify, and you're done. And the goal of these things is to help us make more content, sell more content, and therefore provide to the world better content than we're currently providing.
Quality content. Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about accessibility, right? But if you drill down, what does accessibility actually mean? Right? It means I understand the semantic structure of the document. I know what these elements are other than just text. Mm-hmm. Right? That information doesn't exist inherently in a Word document, for example, until I put it there. But why should I? Right? It's tedious, it's boring. So I have an AI to help me with that, which means once I have that information, it kind of rolls through all the way through the process to help me build accessible ebooks. Mm-hmm. Right? So, like we were talking about that earlier, like building an accessible ebook, for example, should be trivial. We shouldn't be discussing how hard it is. We should be discussing what kind of tools do we need to make it easy for us. You know, and that is just one example. But there's a lot of discussion about content of images for accessibility, right? I mean, Google has an open API where I can upload an image and Google tells me there's a horse, there's a beach, and there's a mountain in it. That's kind of a nice start to tag images. Why does nobody use it? Mm-hmm. You know, and yes, you still review it, and maybe sometimes it gets it right and sometimes it gets it wrong. But at least it gives you a good starting point. It gives you a point where your ebook runs through Daisy, and Daisy says, this is nice, it works. And your reader, you know, gets an ebook which sort of describes the image. And then you spend an extra hour kind of tweaking and tuning everything. But the big part, the big chunk of the work is done. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of, to answer your question, where do you see this all going? That's where I see it going. I don't want to have a headache over these details, basically. Mm-hmm.
I mean, just in tagging on to what Joshua said about the quality, is there's an element of, in creative work, right, of human time that needs to be there, like of a breath, right, to get there. But I would predict that things aren't going to slow down. So if you have these efficiencies that Jens is pointing out, now you have the benefit of getting some of this work done faster. So you have the time, but I think the reason we're all in this business, right, is to say, now what's this unique, wonderful story that I can create out of it? And so it's creating that breath so we don't lose what we love most about the process, but build in some efficiencies. I think these are all going to start coming really quickly. Like, there's not a whole lot of us talking like this now, but I bet you in 5 years, you're all going to be able to have sat up on this panel and talk about AI and, whether it used, random forest or whatever, Dershowitz, like all these phrases that aren't used very often, I think are going to become really common because this is just going to be part of the tool set that lets you do the work that you really want to do even better.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully we're introducing some new efficiencies to everyone's process. Since AI and machine learning have become kind of, they're buzzwords now, right? I think while we were discussing this panel, we were talking about an article where I forget the percentage, it was alarmingly high number of startups mention the words AI and machine learning in their pitches, but do they actually use them, is something we were talking about. So what sort of buzzy uses have you seen, and do they drive you crazy? Do you worry about them kind of like polluting the industry?
Like one of them, I always feel like we're shaking our fist and like, that's just a filter. Some of the stuff that's machine learning or AI, they're just a complex set of filters, which are super useful and sometimes all you need. And we get inbound sometimes of requesting, a machine learning solution or AI solution. And I'm like, yeah, well, we can do this if you need help, but this is just complex filters. So I think it does help the more you know, too, so you don't get caught up by it's AI, therefore I can't even ask the right questions to understand what's happening, so how can I feel good about using it, So I think the more you're in tune with the words and know how to ask the questions, you can weed out some of it and maybe lower your price a bit, too, I probably can think of more, but I'll stop.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of specific examples. I can't think of off the top of my head, but yeah.
When you hear it, you hear it. So you always feel mildly defensive because I've got PhD data scientists who spent years, working on this, and then so when I hear people representing a simplistic solution, I always want to be like, that's not it.
Yeah, I think the media is very, what's the right word, enthusiastic. In with reporting, this is an AI, that's ML, and it's going to take all the jobs and look at what it's doing. But most of the time, when you actually look into it, it's not really, as you say, maybe it's a filter. It's something much more simplistic, and it just gets a lot of attention because it's a buzzword at this point, and the only way I can deal with that is just ask really, a healthy sense of skepticism. If you read all these articles and just kind of raise an eyebrow and think, really, is that actually true, or is it just another buzzy article because it's just hip to talk about it?
And if the article starts in the first sentence saying something about our robots going to take over the world,
right.
I was joking. I was like, I for once would like to be covered, not in an article that mentions robots taking over the world, because there's not the same thing. We're not taking over the world this year. It's way on the roadmap.
Yeah. It's way on the roadmap.
It's totally at least 2 years from now.
At least 2 years.
Yeah.
Think of Bender, right? Bender's a robot for Futurama reference. So I read all these things, and all I see is a drunken robot sitting somewhere in the corner. That kind of tones it all down for me.
Yeah, exactly. Calms it.
Yeah, I think the representation sometimes is more HAL 9000 than Bender, but I feel like Bender is probably really where we're going to end up.
Yeah.
If you just think of anytime someone's talking about AI, it's reaction to big data, which was the phrase before, right? But now that you've got all this big data, you got to figure out a way to make it make sense. So I think that's the least scary way to look at it, is AI is just making sense of big data, because now we've got so much, you can't just review it. And then that should be less robot-y taking over the world. Yeah.
Well, and that's an important way of looking at this for publishing as well, because publishers have lots of data. Lots and lots of data. It's in your books. It's about your books. It's about the sale of your books. It's about the other books that other people sell that you want to compete with. All that data is there. It's sitting there in a variety of places. The more you can pull it together, and the more you can do stuff with it, and whether that's filtering or whether that's AI, whatever you're doing with it, you have to do something with that in order to truly engage your business. And that's what big data really is, and that's what AI is supposed to help us with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think it requires you to understand what you want to get out of it as well.
Super.
I mean, what is it that I want to achieve here in the first place?
Yeah.
And like what you mentioned earlier with the marketing. I mean, what kind of marketing information helps me to sell more books, or to target markets better, to advertise better? And then from that, you kind of work your way backward, and then you end up looking at your pile of data, thinking, do I have the data? Do I need other data? How do I rummage through all of that data to get to the point where I want to get to?
Yeah.
Right? And that's the process of building these kind of things, these AIs.
I wondered after what you just said if it's helpful just to have this in your head too, is that if you're trying to solve something, so you've got all this data, if you have the question you're trying to solve to, this is your training set. And so what you're training to is what you're building your model off of. And so your question that you're asking is super important. And that's one of the benefits of once you get your data in a clean situation, is that now you can ask multiple questions off it. And just very simplistically, you divide it in half. You build the model off half of it, you test on the other half. And so this is what kind of your basic process. And so when they're talking about asking the question is, then do you have the data on this side to train? So if I train a model on, is this a romance book or is this a horror, then I've got to know, I've got to have enough books and identify which they are, train to that, and then test it. It's kind of easy when you can probably tell the difference on your own. But if you had to do it across 10,000 books because you wanted to resort them between some new category, this is an example. You have some new category that you want to put, and you've slogged through a couple of hundred, and you have that data. Well, then now you have a start to where you can start building it. I don't know if that made sense, but that's kind of, I think that's really important to understand is what question you're asking matters, and that's separate from this set of data that you're working with and trying to decipher. Mm-hmm. That may have been too much.
No,
okay.
That sounds like a really good example to me. And I guess like the data is actually probably the really important part. And we kind of covered this as well in terms of bad data or the confirmation bias. Like I put the data I want in, so I get the result that I want out. How does this? I think one of the recent example I saw, again, something kind of going really badly is, did anyone hear about Amazon's hiring algorithm?
No.
So I assume Amazon gets a lot of job applications. I think, I don't know. And so they had an AI go through the job applications to sort out who would be the best candidate for the job. And I assume that the engineers working on this were probably very well-intentioned people. Most people are. Except that the algorithm never picked female candidates. And I'm sure if you had asked any of the engineers, they probably would be like, no, that was not the intention. However, because
the training set had mostly men in it.
Yeah.
And so it reinforced the mostly men as a...
Yeah, so being, I think, very conscious of the data that you use and the result, like, as you guys said, like, you got to ask the right question. And sometimes the right question, you're going to fail a bunch of times before you get to the right question. I've even had this in, like, I did some testing where I tried to get an AI thing that a model I had trained to write 12th century Arthurian poetry. So I picked a very specific data set, obviously, and I accidentally left in some Project Gutenberg page markers. And so my AI just kept returning page markers to me. It would like page marker, sentence, page marker, sentence. And I was like, what is this? But it's because I did not train my data properly. I wanted poetry, I got page markers.
Well, and it points out, to cleaning the data. I mean, it's just like, when you decide to paint a room and you're like, this will be great, it's a small room, but then you spend all day prepping. And then, this is like cleaning data is is a big deal. Like getting it into a place where you can actually run and get accurate results is a huge amount of work. So sometimes we'll go into companies and they'll say, well, we're doing this ourselves, but they can't figure out how to clean. And I mean, as a company, we've spent so long building tools that can clean the data, whether it's books or recognize the elements of the script or pull off the pages and the chapter headings of books that we can really analyze it. So that is no small feat, and it's nothing to kind of, you can't skip that, unfortunately, like painful process.
Yeah, there's still very much a human element.
I mean, and I'm sure you've all encountered that exact process. You've all helped Google train their data, right? When every time you have a little caption on your screen and say, please, mark up all the traffic lights or all the cars or whatever storefronts. You're helping Google train their AI, right? Google gives you random images, and you tell Google, that's a number, that's a car, that's a traffic light. And Google then learns a little bit more and a little bit more. And it's a massive social effort to train data or to categorize and classify data. And because like 10 engineers at Google can't do it. So they just packaged it into conveniently a little captcha, made it a development kit for websites, and suddenly that data reaches billions of people. And billions of people help Google train the data. The interesting social experiment would be, what if all of us would just do the wrong thing? That would be funny, right? Because then things would go wrong, right? Because we would tell that AI, that's not a car, that's a cat, right? And then over time, that AI would learn that everything that looks like a car is a cat, and so it would stick the label cat on every car, which to us is funny, and to that AI, it's just, I'm just labeling stuff, right? But that's how it works.
I don't know if you've ever seen this image, like the puppies or croissants. Like,
yes, I've seen that.
Labradoodles or fried chicken, like, I think we should start testing that. So you guys work with this stuff every day, data and all of the stuff. What is the funniest, weirdest, or worst thing you have ever seen something returned to you?
I had one person who was very enthusiastic, very happy to format their books. The Word document was all over the place, like different fonts, different weights, italic, non-italic sizes, everything. Like she had made use of the entire range of typography within a paragraph. Like there were paragraphs with 24 different stylings in them. Because she thought that is more important than this, but there's a different kind of importance down here. And so she had formatted all these things differently. And so I fed that into my classifier. And it had no clue what to do with it, right? It just got, like the classification that I got for that document was all over the place. And so just for laughs and giggles, I have, like, to test the precision of AIs, I have one classifier which is quite literally like a 5-line classifier, which is a random number generator. So it just randomly classifies stuff, right? It has no clue, no plan, nothing. It just throws out a random label. That thing did better than my AI. because the document was so all over the place, you know? And like I looked and just, I don't know what you mean. And if I don't know what she means, like how is that blob of code supposed to know? Because I've trained it and it just imitates what I'm doing. So I look at the Word document, just, I don't know, right? And so that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
I don't have a great story.
Aww.
Not as good as that one for sure.
Yeah. One thing we did, so the data scientist I'm talking about, I mean, she used to work for NASA and put satellites in the air, went back to get her PhD, and just focused on NLP and television shows. So, I mean, this is 7 years, so she's good at it. I preface it because she walked in with the results when we first started splitting and observing female roles versus male roles in movies. She came, and you know, I'm going to then sell this to the movie studios. And she came back and said, here's what the women look like, basically. And I didn't say it this way, but I thought, she has made a mistake because all the female roles look the same. And so, well, turns out 80% of them are measured to be the same with our technology. And so, but I just remember that moment of thinking, like, I can't sell this. Who wants to see that all the female characters are the same? So we dug in a lot deeper, and now we feature the nuances of characters, but that was both the sad kind of uncovering of, like, wow, you know, they look the same, they're measurably, you know, written in similar fashion.
I think I have a silly one, and then actually I guess they're both kind of silly, but I was testing Shelfie, which is, the role of Shelfie is to scan your bookshelf and identify spines and therefore generate recommendations. So I was testing it for release, and it didn't work out as well as we expected because I discovered a very interesting bug in the program where if it saw a blank, it identifies the shape of spines and then attempts to classify them. And every once in a while, it would catch things like the edge of your bookshelf would be a spine, which it's not. So wood grain, a lot of wood grain when you're looking through the segmenter. And then every once in a while, usually it would say, oh no, it didn't return anything, it's a bookshelf. But every once in a while, it would randomly assign a book to this blank space, and it was always a romance novel. Like
when in doubt.
Like when in doubt, it was when in doubt, go for like a shirtless man on the back of a horse, like, which was great. But I felt a little bit bad for the people whose bookshelves were otherwise not romance content because it, you know, maybe a bit of a mischaracterization. The other one was we did a bit of a hackathon where we used the same thing that produced chapter headings instead of poetry for me. We all tested it, and everyone tried to test it with different data sets, and one of my colleagues tested it with recipes. Tried to produce a cookbook using only an AI, and it's apparently astounding how many recipes open with step 1 being cream together butter and sugar, because that was pretty much how every one of his recipes began, even if butter and sugar were not in the ingredients list. So we have a lot of fun with it.
Every good recipe starts.
Apparently every good recipe starts with butter and sugar. So I think we have a little bit of time before questions. Do you guys have any like last kernels of wisdom before we open it up for questions?
I think my main point is don't be afraid of AI, because it's not here for your job. It's here to help you. But be, as I think Jens put it, be skeptical, right? Look at it carefully. If somebody says this is AI, figure out if it actually is. You've got the definition, right? If it actually is, and it actually has some benefit, then look at how you can engage that in your workflow to help you do a better job with what you do. Save you time, save you energy, save you money, and help you make better books.
Mm-hmm. Jens, Monica?
Concur. Yes. Be courageous.
Yeah. So does anyone have any questions for us or comments?
So I want to know, you were talking earlier about getting publishing ready. How ready do you think publishing is with their data for all this? Because I know what you're talking about requires them to have good data, the garbage in, garbage out. So how far are we away from the garbage in for all three, like in general with publishing?
Yeah.
You're ready. You're ready. You got
Yeah.
books. You got books. You got sales data. You have goals. I mean, it's all there, and you can identify your goals, whether it's awards or you know. I mean, so from my point of view, you've got all you need.
I'll give the caveat. You have all you need, but a lot of times it's not clean.
Yeah.
That's where the concern is for most publishers, is that data that you do have, is it consistent, is it correct, is it tagged properly? You know, if, you know, on the metadata side, if you have citations set up properly, then you've got good data set. If you just have a bunch of text that's not broken out, you don't know who the source was, when it was published, or where it was published, that kind of information is actually helpful in classifying that data. So I would say, as a publisher, look at what you've got. If you're using Excel spreadsheets to manage your data, probably could do something better. If you have your books, you've got good data in the books, but you have to find ways of extracting it, right? But and it's broader than that too. When you look at your sales data, how are you engaging that? Are you bringing it all into one place where you can analyze it and compare it against other data that you're pulling up and that you're think is important? Are you comparing that to your sales rank on Amazon? Are you comparing your prices to your sales rank? Are you comparing your other things to other things? That comparison process is where you can start to actually use the data you've got. And if you don't have good data, you won't be able to do the comparison.
So the follow-up to that is, how do we get to that good data? Like, if we're not there, are there steps to get there?
Yeah.
Or is that well beyond, like...
Oh, no, publishers are doing this all the time. I mean, most of the time it involves getting a system that's a single source of information for most of your data. It may be the single source of information for your metadata and some of your other, product data. You may have another single source for your sales data. You may have another single source for the product, the information inside of your books. Those different pieces, those different databases will be useful and can be compared to each other and used with each other to engage that. But you may have to focus on one at a time. Let me get my metadata figured out first. Let me get my book data figured out. Let me get my sales data figured out, and clean it up and put it into a system that you can then access.
So I think in general, building and training in AI is a very complex process. It's awesome when it works, less so when it doesn't, as we talked about. But training is a careful process, and it takes effort. It takes human effort, because we need to label the data so that the training can happen in the first place. And so if you as a publisher have all the data and half of it is labeled and ready to go and the other half isn't, then that's an effort and kind of a forward investment you have to decide on. Is it worthwhile spending the human resources on cleaning up and labeling the data so that in the future we will benefit from it or not? And that's a risk you have to take, right? And I think it's worthwhile taking, but I'm biased.
I think we mentioned, like, knowing what questions you want answered, right? Like, publishers have mountains of data, but if you don't really know what the answers, or like the questions that you want to ask for the answers you want to achieve, it can maybe feel kind of overwhelming to say, well, here's all of our sales data, or here's all of our metadata. But if your question is, oh, how are we doing in the fiction space for, sci-fi? Okay, well, step one, let's look at all of our sci-fi books. Okay, step two is the sales data for the sci-fi books. And then by breaking that down, I think it becomes much more manageable. But you've got to, I think, go into it with a lot of intention. You can't just be like, okay, let's throw all of our data into a machine and hope for the best. It'll tell us everything we need to know.
Yeah, and there's no point to clean all this. Don't get it organized until you know your question, because that'll then identify what work you actually need to do. Because that's part of what we've built, is to tag everything so that then you can get on to the actual. So, our philosophy is let's find a way to automatically tag it, so now we can look at thousands versus individually. So you lose some of the, you're not, AI's not 100% accurate, but it means it's mostly accurate, and then someone can quickly review and you're done with that part. But it also depends on what element you want to tag. Like, we can recognize whether it's Mexican food recipe or Thai food, right? So you don't need to go through, thousands of recipes and do that. But then maybe there's other things that we don't recognize yet. You have to build a different model for. But I think it's, the other thing is that it is hard, and that's, there's a lot of different types of data scientists, and there's different kinds of machine learning, and that's one of the things we run into sometimes, is that that it does take, it is hard, and you have a different data scientist who's going to tag for metadata than who's going to work on pricing algorithms. Those are different. And so that's sometimes one of the challenges I see, is that it's hard to get just the information within your company to then ask the questions and do it is, right? That's why people have PhDs, right? It turns out it's hard.
I don't have a question, but I just have an idea. I wanted to share. Every time I think of AI, sometimes I think of Miyazaki Hayao, the filmmaker and the animator, who even refused to use computer to do his original drawing and painting. But I think I agree that by introducing AI into our life, we can push our creativeness and originality further. Push us to think more and think more differently. So that's what I think about of AI.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's it.
No, I like that idea, because then that changes the way then you bring it into. We joke a lot when I'm, working with new customers of it's like when you plan your creative discussion and you think of the people you want to have at the table, but the person you bring in is Sheldon from The Big Bang, and who's not your instant go-to for creativity, but they bring this new way of looking at creative content. And so and sometimes I think that's the experience. So if you have an open mind, then you don't mind Sheldon very systematically reporting, this information back to you.
Character in a marketing show. And another point is, I do believe all the things you input into AI, the output totally depends on your input. So it's like we use AlphaGo to play the chess, but all the things depends on your input, which means when we put the AI, the things on art or creation, I don't think it's impossible that the computer cannot simulate Miyazaki Hayao's style, because we have used computer to simulate every specific Chinese calligraphy. It's possible, but totally depends on the input. So, which means we need to think something different.
So, and that's the thing, right? There might be an AI that can simulate Miyazaki's style, but I doubt it will be able to create a story that is consistent, coherent, and meaningful to humans for 1.5 hours, like with the written stories, right? You can imitate Mark Twain, but can you imitate it over 10 pages and still make sense? That's the other thing. And even if that happens, then we're kind of getting to the infinite monkey problem, right? You take an infinite number of monkeys and give them typewriters. Eventually, they will produce the works of Shakespeare, right? It's inevitable that this happens, but it's not necessarily a reliable thing to happen. It just is a coincidence. And so I agree, like AI can maybe imitate certain styles and maybe make a Miyazaki movie, but that movie might suck.
And that's going to be the 99-cent Kindle book in the future, right? I mean, the 99-cent Kindle book of the future is the AI-generated Kindle book, and the $9.99 that you sell will still be the better quality one. So there's going to be, if we ever get to that point, there will still, I think, be a distinction between human-generated creativity and AI-generated creativity. There's going to be something we can tell. It's like if you look at, how many of you actually pulled up the "this is not a person, this face is not a person, does not exist"? So did any of you see the big hole on the side of somebody's head as you were recycling the page? Refresh the page a couple of times, and you'll see somebody who has a big hole in the side of the head or some other kind of weird thing going on. And you're like, oh, it's not perfect. Mm-hmm. It won't ever, in my opinion, get perfect to the point where everybody can tell immediately that it is, that it can't tell that it's AI.
It often reminds me of photographs of, look, that elephant can paint a picture. Right? When you look objectively, what the elephant does, it takes a brush, it takes color, and smears it over the page. That's what the elephant does. Me as an observer, when I look at the picture, maybe I interpret that as a pretty picture, but that is just me projecting things. Right? Doesn't mean the elephant had an intent and a creativity and a vision of painting a picture, it just had fun smearing color around. Right? So we have to be very careful about how we talk about AIs and what the AI does and how much I project onto the result of that AI, right? And so yeah, the AI can help me be creative. It can help me solve tasks much more efficiently. But at the end of the day, I am the creative person. I am the one who is writing the story, who has the idea and the vision and the intent, right? And that's what an AI just doesn't have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the models that are out there, if you're using, Watson, it's trained on all text. So it's trained on emails and Wikipedia. I mean, it's trained on everything, right? And so the other thing of these models, like the models we use and models, you can always ask, what is it trained on? Like, is it trained on fiction? If we're delivering stuff to educational publishers, well, it's not using our model that's trained on fiction, right? It's using a model that's trained on this type of work. And that's one of the things that can happen now that didn't happen 5 years ago, because now you really can get that narrow. Whereas groups, Amazon's not. They're purposely doing these big models that are general enough to be accurate across broad expanse. But what you're going to see that the companies popping up is they're going to be specifically trained. And that's just another question you can ask.
Mm-hmm. I guess I had a quick question related to our relationship with data scientists who are going to be actually creating this. As publishers or as people working within publishing groups, are publishers going to be looking, should they be hiring? And is that something that we can expect, or is this work that will probably happen through a partnership or a third party or an additional company that just does data mining?
I think it'll get less expensive. I think you sure wouldn't want to hire the equivalent of my team now, and that wouldn't make sense. Now there's some companies that can do it and have that, but I think in the future, yes, you'd have that. I think the most really quality hire right now is someone who can have those, who knows enough to ask the questions and integrate. Because again, it's hard to build, it's hard to integrate. So the first step I would say is get someone who can communicate, and that's a lot of times the people that I'm talking to in different companies, are the people who can ask the right questions and then know how to integrate it successfully in the company. I hear all the time we don't want another platform that we have to log into. Okay, great, we can API it. These are the kind of conversations I think you want to get set up. So if I were doing it in stages, I'd recommend first get someone, if you're hiring, who can integrate and understand and ask the questions. And let some of the companies who are spending, comparatively lots of money now because some of the technology is still new, so I'd say the first thing, if you figure out how you can use it, now you can decide whether you want to build it internally. And I also say that to companies all the time. Well, fine, use us to test it and see if it works. And then if you want to go build it on your own, then do, but partly you just don't want to, this is my opinion, you don't want to make that investment on trying to hire people and then being so reliant because you can only afford a couple of data scientists on exactly what they say. Then you're limited to only what they can build. And what you want to do is get broad groups of data scientists that you're able to integrate from.
Yeah.
I don't know, would you agree? I mean,
I agree.
okay.
Yeah, and I think that how many of you are the most technical person at your publishing house? How
Or
many?
top 1%.
Yeah.
Be confident.
How many of you are a part of a very small subset of people at your publishing house who actually know technology very well? So
Yeah.
you are that person in some ways.
Yeah.
You're the person who needs to know about this stuff, because your knowledge and your ability to grok that is going to make a difference to your publisher as to whether or not they should be doing some other thing, and whether they should adopt that technology or bring in that person or whatever. So your comfortability with this, your understanding of this, is going to make a huge difference to how well your company can adapt to it as it changes.
Yeah, there's 100, right, maybe that's too many. Say there's 20 great solutions that maybe you need. I wouldn't want to then pick one and start building it and 2 years later decide you don't need it. So I would find ways to cherry pick and test and see what works for your company.
Yeah, that was a really good question. And I'm getting like the signal to wrap up.
I thought she was just dancing.
Yeah, I thought she was dancing. Thank you guys. This was awesome.
Thank you
I think we all learned a lot. And thank you all for listening and for your fantastic questions. It was awesome. Great.